So I'm going to move to knowledge of risk of hepatitis and AIDS on the part of the Manchester Children's Hospital, or more specifically Dr. Evans. There's little direct material, but we do know that Dr. Evans was a regular attender at UK HCDO annual meetings of Haemophilia Centre directors in both the 70s and the 80s. He wasn't present at the October 83 meeting, but Dr. Stevens represented him there. And so there is, I think, no reason to think he would have been anything other than aware of the discussions that were taking place, the presentations by Dr. Krask on behalf of the Hepatitis Working Party, and so on. And in relation to AIDS, not only would he have been, as director, a recipient of the letters from Dr. Krask, Professor Bloom and Dr. Ritzer in March and June of 1983, but Dr. Evans was one of those who attended that January 1983 meeting with Immuno at the London Airport Hotel, at which there was an update on the precise state of knowledge from the States about numbers infected, numbers of haemophiliacs infected, the San Francisco baby, the New England Journal of Medicine article, and the like. So that general material may be our best guide to what was or should have been known by Dr. Evans and those working at the Manchester Children's Hospital. There are possibly, I think, two documents in relation to hepatitis that it may be worth briefly looking at. The first clinic is DHSC 010018_099. So this is a case, a form reporting post-transfusion hepatitis completed by Dr. Evans at the Manchester Children's Hospital, Pendlebury. It refers, if we go down the page under the heading Brief Clinical Notes, to it being an 18-month-old boy with newly diagnosed haemophilia. And then if we go further down the page towards the last quarter or so, under the heading Remarks, this appears to be a clear-cut case of serum hepatitis. That seems to be the view recorded from Dr. Evans at the Pendlebury. And then at the very bottom of the page, it refers to attempts to trace donors. It says, at the very last lines, since the patient is hepatitis B antigen negative, the hepatitis may be due to another virus. And that, I think, may have been completed by the Regional Transfusion Director, Dr. Wadsworth, although it's not entirely clear. So there, in any event, from 1974, December 1974, is a discussion of hepatitis and the recognition of the existence of a virus other than hepatitis B.
It's also of interest because the description used is not hepatitis B by Dr. Evans, but serum hepatitis.
Yes.
So he's using the portmanteau phrase, which covers any post-transfusion viral infection.
Yes.
Which creates hepatitis.
Yes, precisely. And then if we go to PRSE 303946. This is a Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting. It was, in fact, the Glasgow meeting, 30th of September 1980, which you'll recall was followed by the symposium on unresolved problems in hepatitis in haemophilia, which explored the issue of hepatitis in some detail. And if we go to page 14, there's a reference to Dr. Evans here. It's specifically in relation to discussion about a Highland product. Dr. Evans raised the question as to whether it was sensible to encourage the manufacture of the new low-potency factor VIII concentrate, which was cheaper but not so clean as the other products. There was some discussion regarding the factor VIII concentrate and the hepatitis risk with all concentrates, and it was agreed that the new Highland product was just as good as any other product for everyday use. So there's a particular reference to Dr. Evans and a discussion about the hepatitis risk from concentrates. But beyond that, as I say, our best evidence of what Dr. Evans did or should have known will be through his fairly regular attendance at and participation in the regular meetings.
Plus whatever he would have read, and since he wrote in the Lancet later on, or about this time too, no doubt he read that.
Yes, absolutely. There's quite a lot of evidence. There's obviously the oral evidence we've heard from a number of clinicians, but also some of the witness evidence we have from clinicians who are not giving oral evidence. We've asked a number of them what kind of materials they read. The Lancet is almost invariably there. A number refer also to reading the BMJ, the New England Journal of Medicine. Some also say they read the MMWRs. But so you're absolutely right. There's no reason to think that publications such as the Lancet or indeed New England Journal of Medicine would have been unfamiliar to Dr. Evans.
And no doubt, given the material we've already seen, there were links with the Haemophilia Society, and so whatever concerns the members of the Haemophilia Society were expressing through that route, he would be aware of as well.
Yeah, possibly, yes. His own direct involvement with the Haemophilia Society, there certainly appears to be, there was the seminar and so on. He became, I think, a member of the Society
that was later on.
Trustees, but that's later on. So I'm not going to go to the underlying documents, but we've got some evidence of patients being infected with hepatitis B in the 1980s. So there's a Manchester Children's Hospital patient infected with hepatitis B in 1984 and recorded as having passed that on to his mother. And then 2 patients in 1986 reported to have been infected with hepatitis B. There are then, in relation to HIV, 2 documents it's probably worth having a quick look at. HSOC 0012997. This is from the Royal Manchester Children's Hospital to the Haemophilia Society, so the links you've referred to, they're established March 1987. It is actually from a clinical psychologist in the Children's Hospital's Department of Clinical Psychology, but it's about, if you look over the page, the AIDS virus and how to live with it. And if we go to page 14, it's a series of leaflets directed clearly at patients, child patients. And it's instructive to see what's said here. Do you mean I'm HIV positive because of my treatment? Is the question that's posed. Yes. Some years ago, some of the freeze-dried concentrate imported from America were infected by the virus. At that time, no one was aware that this was so. It took time before it was known that AIDS was carried by a virus, and longer before it was known that it was present in blood and blood products. Knowing this might well make you angry and upset. It might make you feel angry with the hospital staff and the treatment too. It might make you feel how unfair it is for this to happen to you. It's natural to feel like that. This is what has happened, and it's upsetting for you and your family. The hospital staff had no idea at the time that their treatment carried this risk. And whether that was, as at 1987, a correct, open, candid account, it may be a matter that you will wish to consider. I should say, so I won't go to the document, there is evidence to suggest that one patient at Manchester Children's Hospital may have been infected with HIV after being treated with cryoprecipitate only, not with concentrates. And we've given the documentary reference to that in our written note. The last document on the topic of knowledge of risk is STHB 40259. This is an article published in Haemophilia 1997 containing Dr. Evans' reflections. It's called 21 Years of Haemophilia. If we go to page 7, please. Just want to pick up left-hand column, bottom half of the page. Under the heading Haemophilia A, says this, or Dr. Evans says this: it was apparent by 1983 that the risk of infection was greater with concentrates derived from large donor pools, and advice was given to change from large pool products to cryoprecipitate.
That's reference to Deforge.
Let me double check. I'm sure you're right. Yes, you're absolutely right, it is. But because AIDS was still rare, the cause was unknown, the benefits of home treatment with concentrate were substantial, and a change back to cryoprecipitate would have disrupted the arrangements for making freeze-dried concentrate in the UK. This advice was not followed.
Now, that gives a different reason for not changing back to cryoprecipitate. The reason that we've seen from other documentation, particularly in relation to the Committee for Safety for Medicines Biological Subcommittee, was that it was simply supply.
Yes.
This is not supply.
Doesn't appear to be.
This is, we can't make as much of our own factor concentrate as we would have wanted to.
That appears to be Dr. Evans' reasoning. Yes. We've already looked at an example of the correspondence between Dr. Arenstam and Dr. Evans referring to AIDS.
Just yes. For a moment, could we just have that document back? Because I've just spotted something in the next paragraph. Yes, it's the reference then to the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe.
Yes.
Yes.
Which again we've looked at in earlier hearings.
Yeah. But he makes specific reference to two matters, and to the Deforge article and to the Council of Europe.
Yes. Yes, he also refers, the footnote 44 is to Dr. Jones's article in the British Medical Journal in 1983. He also references. So we looked at an example of communications from 1983 between Trelaws and Dr. Evans. There are other examples, I'm not going to go to them, but there are a number of examples of letters being written by the clinicians at Trelaws to Dr. Evans, and as we'll see next week, to other haemophilia clinicians in the spring and early summer of 1983, which talk about looking for the stigmata of AIDS or carrying out some form of tests or AIDS-related tests. So the next topic of some importance in relation to Manchester Children's Hospital is the means by which the test results were communicated to patients and their parents. And we can look at two documents. We've heard some oral evidence on this very topic from families. We can look at two documents. WITN 0553002 and we looked at this again during Mrs. Bennett's oral evidence, I think. So this is a letter from August of 1985, and you will see from this that the communication about a child's infection with HIV, HTLV3, was done by letter. We've been sending blood samples away from the children with haemophilia and similar diseases to see if they're at risk of AIDS. None of our patients has developed AIDS or has shown any signs of doing so, but all of us, both parents and staff, are anxious about the problem. The results are now coming through, and this is August of 1985, this letter. The blood tests on your child, Alistair, show that he is positive for antibodies to HTLV3. And then it goes on to say, it doesn't mean he has AIDS, but there's a small chance, Dr. Evans says, that he may get it. Of the first 16 patients we've tested, over 60% have given a positive result. Nearly all of them have been treated with the old factor VIII concentrates made in the USA. So, there are a number of questions which may arise in the mind reading that letter. The first and most obvious one may perhaps be why test results of this kind about children were being communicated by letter. And this isn't the only example. So if we go to WITN 1736002, next page. So we see essentially an identical letter, or near identical letter, but this is the 31st of May 1985. So again, testing only being carried out and results only being communicated in mid-1985 in relation to children, which seems fairly late, and the communication in this form. And parents being told there's a small chance that the child may develop AIDS. What the factual basis for that was unclear. There is also evidence we've received from parents or other family members, infected patients, that they were not aware that they were being tested for HTLV3. We also have some witness evidence of there being...
It's almost said that they weren't aware in the first sentence, isn't it?
It's the most obvious inference to draw from the
because why would you say we have been testing all our children, basically, to someone who already knew that they had tested their own child?
Precisely so. The language is much more consistent with this having been done without knowledge of the families. We have evidence from a witness who recalls there being, in the summer of 1985, 2 meetings held at Pendlebury.
What is also curious, if that's right, as to the interpretation of the first sentence, is the next sentence. All of us, both parents and staff, are anxious about the problem. And so, although it appears anxiety has been expressed, it does not seem that the consultant, in response to the expressions of anxiety, has said, we're testing, or we will test, or anything of that sort.
Yes, it's right to note that there's a slightly different angle given by Dr. Evans in a letter that he wrote to the Lancet, which we'll look at in a moment.
Yes.
But before I go there, yes, just to say, we know that or we understand from witness evidence we've received that there were meetings to discuss AIDS and HIV in 1985. So it's similar to the kind of meetings we've heard, the group meetings being held to provide a degree of information. But again, summer of 1985 seems quite late compared to the evidence we've heard about meetings being held in other centres some months earlier than that. So the document I mentioned a moment ago, which is Dr. Evans to the Lancet, is a letter he wrote in September 1987. It is at RLIT 40454. Right-hand side, halfway down the page, there's a letter headed Human Immunodeficiency Virus and the Law, and this is a letter from Dr. Evans. The topic is about how to tell the patients, the children, of the results. But you'll see in the first paragraph, what's said is, when the test was introduced in this centre early in 1985, many parents asked us to test their sons, is the way in which it's put by Dr. Evans there. And then he says we gave the results to the parents, not to the boys. And then he talks about the issue of whether the children themselves should be told, and if so, how and by whom.
But what about the next sentence? Subsequently, we've only tested boys with their parents' consent.
Yes.
So that implies that previously they hadn't had the parents' consent necessarily.
Yes. But we've nothing else which throws any further light on the issue, so that your best guide may be those letters that we see.
Yes.
And then, just in terms of the numbers of patients who were infected with HIV at the Manchester Children's Hospital, there is reference in a letter from Dr. Evans. I don't think we need to go to it. He talks in 1987 about looking after over 20 boys and young men with HIV, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were all infected through treatment at Manchester Children's Hospital. The data we have from UKHCDO, if we go to INQY 40250, we've got a table which the inquiry team has created from data provided to it by UKHCDO. There are, as set out here, a number of qualifications to the data. We're told by UKHCDO it's provisional data that they provided to us, and the table has been put together from it by the inquiry team and not by UKHCDO. If we go to the third page, please, Xiaoming. We've got the centre number in the left-hand column. Manchester Children's is just over halfway down the table, number 61. We can see there what's said to be a total of 16 HIV cases reported to UKHCDO, and it's important to emphasise UKHCDO only has information about the cases reported to it, and this is up to 1988. What they appear to show are 7 cases 1985, 2 1984, 1 1983, 2 1982, 3 1981, 1 1979. That presumably reflects retrospective testing on stored samples.
Well, it can't do anything else.
It can't, no. When that was carried out, whether it was carried out systematically, how reliable those seroconversion ranges are, I'm afraid we don't have any more information which enables us to assess that. But that's the information in terms of provisional data that the inquiry has received from UKHCDO. The position then in relation to testing for hepatitis C, again, there's no real clear documentary trail, so we can take that down. And the data so far received from UKHCDO doesn't enable us to place any kind of reliable figures before you. Your best evidence in terms not necessarily of numbers, but of when people were tested, what they were told, whether there were delays between tests being undertaken and results being communicated, may well be the individual accounts that the inquiry has received from patients or from family members. There are some documents referring to undertaking liver tests over the years. Again, that's consistent with what we've seen in relation, I think, to pretty much all centres. If we go to WITN 1244007, this is a letter from Dr. Evans, November 1990, and if we look at the last paragraph, Dr. Evans says, and this is referring to elevated results in liver function tests in the 1980s. These elevations of the serum transaminase are common in haemophiliacs. They're thought to indicate some upset of liver function, but a proper diagnosis cannot be made without a liver biopsy, which entails sticking a needle into the liver. And he says it's not an investigation undertaken lightly in haemophilia, even less likely to be undertaken in patients with inhibitors. However, the doctors at Sheffield have a particular interest in hepatitis and have done a large number of liver biopsies. They may have other ways of diagnosing hepatitis, but on the evidence we have, I cannot say that either of the boys have hepatitis at present, although it's possible that they've had such in the past. The slightly odd thing about this letter is, if it had been written a number of years earlier, one might have been able to understand it, but it's late November 1990, by which time there was at least some available testing for hepatitis C, to which no reference is made. Again, without going into the detail of individual witness statements, the inquirers received evidence from patients at the Children's Hospital who say they were tested for hepatitis C without their knowledge and consent. There are a number of miscellaneous matters in relation to the Children's Hospital and information from documents that we've set out in our written note. We've set out the studies, trials, surveys that we've been able to trace. And we've provided some detail about Dr. Evans' subsequent involvement with the Haemophilia Society, but I don't propose to go through any of those documents now. So that's the Manchester Children's Hospital. I'm just going to deal very much more shortly now with some smaller centres from the northwest region. So the next is Booth Hall. Again, it was a children's hospital. Dr. Evans was also the director and consultant haematologist there. It had a UKHCDO centre number, but if we look at sorry, I'll find the right document. HCDO 40138_012. You'll see this is a document headed Haemophilia Centres in the UK, coding used in Oxford 1977 to 1982. And we can see the supra-regional groups there listed. If we go over the page, top of the page, we've got the Manchester supra-region, centres 60 to 79. And you can see there reference to Booth Hall Children's Hospital. It's got a centre number, centre 68. But it, in common with Leighton Hospital, is recorded as being not an official centre and there being special arrangements. It was, perhaps no doubt because of both geographical proximity and the role of Dr. Evans, closely limited to the Manchester Children's Hospital. There are some documents that describe it as an associate centre of the Children's Hospital, and the annual returns were generally submitted and filed together. We can take the document down, thank you, Shamik. I'm not going to go to the annual returns. The numbers of patients treated were very small. So if we look at, and I'm just going to take the details from the documents without going to them. So 1977, there's one patient with von Willebrand's, 7 patients with haemophilia A, 1 patient with Christmas disease. Treated 1978, 8 patients with haemophilia A, 1 patient with Christmas disease. Similar numbers in 1979. 1980, 4 patients with haemophilia A, 1 patient with von Willebrand's treated. In 81, it's 3 patients with haemophilia A, 2 with von Willebrand's. 1982, 3 patients with haemophilia A, 1 with haemophilia B treated. 1983, 2 haemophilia A patients treated. And then we don't have, I think, the figures for 84 and 85. 1986, 8 patients, a number of patients recorded as registered, but no patients recorded as treated. So small numbers of patients. And then in terms of the treatment that was used, again, I think I can do this without taking time going to the underlying returns, but we have looked at and analysed the returns. The treatment for haemophilia A patients recorded in the annual returns with this small number is cryoprecipitate. So cryo in 1977, 1978, 1979, 1980, 1981, 1982 and 1983 that haemophilia A patients, and in those years when von Willebrand's patients were treated with cryoprecipitate, the haemophilia B patients in the years in which there was any treatment at all of a haemophilia B patient was with NHS factor 9. There's no obvious evidence of any home treatment programme either, and the amounts of cryoprecipitate used are relatively small. Because Dr. Evans was the consultant haematologist at Booth Hall as well as the Children's Hospital, what I've already said about his knowledge of risk, or what might be said to be his assumed knowledge of risk of hepatitis and HIV, applies equally in relation to Booth Hall. There are just a couple of documents relating to patients at Booth Hall who were treated not because of a bleeding disorder, but treated following burns that it might be relevant just to look at. So if we go to NHBT 0098216. So it's a letter, August 1992, from Dr. Evans to Dr. Love at the Blood Transfusion Service. There's reference there to a young, it said a young man, it's a 12-year-old boy, who has PCP and AIDS, which we think is almost certainly related to transfusion. And then there's reference to treatment at Booth Hall in 1984 for burns and receiving units of blood and plasma, as well as an exchange transfusion at birth. So that's a patient at the hospital treated in 84 and potentially being infected with AIDS as a result of that treatment. There is also witness evidence. Don't think I'll need to go to the statement. But of another child being treated as a baby at Booth Hall in 1987 and understood treated with plasma and infected with hepatitis C. So some broader evidence relating to infection at Booth Hall. We don't have any information about whether bleeding disorder patients at Booth Hall were infected with HIV. Given the limited numbers and the fact that the treatment was with cryoprecipitate only, that's perhaps unsurprising, or with hepatitis C, other than those the two non-bleeding disorder cases I've just mentioned. The other fact to note about Booth Hall was that it contained something called the North Manchester Regional Virus Laboratory. There's documentation that we've referred to in our written note to suggest that that laboratory was set up in 1971 because the Public Health Laboratory Service in Manchester was unable to meet the demand for its services. It also reflected geographical advantages in terms of hospitals in northern Manchester being able to access a virus laboratory. There's reference to the North Manchester Regional Virus Laboratory undertaking hepatitis B testing. There's some correspondence between the laboratory and the Public Health Laboratory Service in 1985 about HTLV3 testing, although it appears that testing was undertaken at the Public Health Laboratory Service and by Dr. Tedder at the Middlesex. But there is then evidence to suggest that in late 1990, the Regional Virus Laboratory at Booth Hall was undertaking hepatitis C testing on Manchester adult patients. And some of the data we've got suggests that there was hepatitis C testing on some stored samples as well. And because there's reference to samples from 88 and 89 being tested. The next centre I'm going to mention is Myler Hospital, which was based in Wrexham in North Wales. Again, a very small haemophilia centre treating a handful of bleeding disorder patients in the 1970s and 1980s. It too is referred to in one of the lists that we have as not an official centre and being subject to special arrangements, although, like Booth Hall, it had a centre number. It was centre number 70. There are a number of names, clinician names, that appear in the documentation. It's not we've not found it easy to identify who the director, if there was a formal director, might have been at any one time. The 82 and 83 returns, which again appear to have been provided alongside the Manchester Children's Hospital returns to Oxford, list Dr. Owens as director. The 1985 return lists Dr. Evans as the director. There are various other names, including Dr. Thompson, and then from the mid-80s, Dr. Watson, and a handful of others that crop up in the correspondence. It would appear that Milo, as well as having a relationship with the Manchester Children's Hospital, had a relationship with Liverpool, at least in terms of the supply of blood products. So the evidence suggests that the Liverpool Regional Transfusion Centre supplied cryoprecipitate to Milo and blood to Milo. Again, there are very small numbers of patients recorded as registered and treated. And I think, again, I'll without going to the documents, I can give the data that we have. 1981, the annual return shows a single haemophilia B patient treated with NHS factor 9. 1982 shows again a single haemophilia B patient being treated with NHS factor 9 and one haemophilia A patient treated with cryoprecipitate in hospital. 1983, again, it's only one haemophilia B patient treated with NHS factor 9, the same in 1984 and 1985. 1986, there's evidence of a haemophilia B patient registered and treated with NHS factor 9 at home. So very limited information about treatment. There are a couple of interesting exchanges of correspondence between a clinician at Myla and Trelaws in relation to two patients, which indicate, and again, we'll see this pattern when we look at Trelaws in more detail next week, but the pattern of the pupil being treated by the Trelaws team during school term and then returning during the holidays and being treated by the home centre. And there's a series of letters, again, we've set out the details in full in our note, from 1974 onwards, showing the patient being treated with cryoprecipitate at Myla. And then there's a discussion between Trelaws and Myla about home treatment. And there's reference to the possibility of using cryoprecipitate at home. And it's Dr. Kirk at Trelaws who mentions that the patient has a deep freeze at home. It's Dr. Thompson at Myla who queries whether the deep freeze would be sufficiently reliable, and Dr. Kirk seems to suggest that that's a valid point. And what transpires by 1976 is a switch from cryoprecipitate to concentrates. But it's right to say that appears to have been the decision of Trelaws rather than the Myla clinician. And then there's a letter referring to cryobilin being used and Immuno sending that cryobilin directly to Myla for use with the patient. That's in 1976. There's reference to the patient being given that treatment on a prophylactic basis. And then there are discussions in 1977 between Myla and Trelaws about supplies of concentrate for use during school holidays. And there's a debate about whether to use Lister concentrate, so the NHS concentrate, which is all that the Liverpool Blood Transfusion Centre could supply, rather than cryobilin. And then the other records that we have from Trelaws essentially show, reflecting that exchange of correspondence, the patient receiving predominantly cryoprecipitate until the mid-70s, then from 1976 concentrate initially with cryobilin, but then from 1977 with a range of products, not just cryobilin, but haemophil coate and factor 8, as well as NHS factor 8. Again, what's interesting about the correspondence perhaps is what's not in there. there are discussions about the development of antibodies as a risk, but no other discussions about what other risks might develop as a result of the treatment course. There's a second exchange of correspondence in relation to a different patient. Again, it's similar themes. I don't propose to go through it, but it's initially contemplating the use of cryoprecipitate, but the domestic freezer not thought to be suitable by way of storage. There's a suggestion of contacting the patient's GP and seeing if the cryoprecipitate could be stored there, but that doesn't work out. And the patient then being treated with the NHS concentrate from Liverpool, but again, the patient's overall treatment record shows predominant treatment with cryoprecipitate until 77, and then a range of different concentrates at the main source. But again, the treatment decisions appear to be led from Trilors rather than from Mylor. There is little information available about the knowledge of risk on the part of the Mylor clinicians. There's no reference to Dr. Owens attending any UK HCDO meetings in the 70s or in the 80s. And although Mylor had a centre number, it's not clear whether the minutes would have been sent to Mylor because it was regarded as not an official centre. There is an exchange of correspondence. In relation to the two patients I've referred to, there is, I should have said, a reference to a particular batch of haemophil being infected with hepatitis in 1974. So that's Mylor. The next centre is Leighton Hospital in Crewe. Again, as we saw from one of the documents we looked at earlier, described as not an official haemophilia centre as being subject to special arrangements, but it did have its own centre number, it was Centre 69, and there's a letter from Dr. Gunson in the mid-80s which describes it as an associate centre, so its status is not entirely clear. Its annual returns were also provided alongside the Manchester Children's Hospital. It's not always clear as to who the director is. So there are references to Dr. Howard Allison being director in 1977. The 1982 return refers to the director as paediatrician Dr. Chandran/Dr. Evans. Dr. Chandran's listed in 1983. 1984 and 1995 gives the director as Dr. Evans. Again, Leighton was part of the Northwest Super-Regional Network. There was an occasional reference to Dr. Allison attending super-regional meetings. We go to... Yes, just it doesn't cast any particular light on Leighton, but there's just one document I wanted to flag up, NHBT 00945880. It's a meeting of the Northwest Super-Regional Haemophilia directors. We can see Dr. Allison is listed as present. There's some discussion then about supplies and different arrangements in Manchester and Liverpool for supplies of product. But if we go over the next page, it's just the last two lines that caught my eye. The business meeting was concluded to be followed by a scientific session and then by a dinner courtesy of Armour Pharmaceuticals. And that's in 1986. The available documentation suggests that Leighton received its blood and blood products from the Regional Transfusion Centre at Manchester, at least in the 1980s. Again, in terms of treatment and numbers of patients, the figures are, I think I can take without going to the underlying documents. So the numbers of patients treated are small. 1977, 3 haemophilia A patients treated with cryoprecipitate. The next return we have is 1980, 1 haemophilia A patient treated with cryoprecipitate. The same in 1981, 1 haemophilia A patient with cryo. 1982, 2 von Willebrand's patients treated with cryoprecipitate. 1983, the same. There's some evidence again of the von Willebrand's patients being treated in 1984, and possibly 1 von Willebrand's patient being treated in 1985 by cryoprecipitate. Again, a similar pattern to the other smaller centres we've looked at. Little information available about what any individual clinicians at Leighton would have known, other than what Dr. Evans, as director at Manchester Children's Hospital, would have known. There's no recorded attendance of Dr. Allison or Dr. Chandran at UK HCDO meetings in the 70s or 80s. And because of the slightly unclear status of the hospital or the centre, we can't say for certain that they would have received the minutes. But clearly, they're part of a region in which a number of other haemophilia clinicians would have received the minutes and participated in the meetings. There's some evidence of involvement in the 1995 look-back exercise in relation to patients who received blood transfusions, but no data about numbers of patients infected, if any, with HIV or hepatitis C. From the treatment with cryoprecipitate at Leighton. That takes me next to the Blackpool Haemophilia Centre. Again, very small centre. It's not clear how long or over what period of time there was a centre at the Blackpool Victoria Hospital. There's reference in 1985 to a BPL, batch of factor 8, being issued to Blackpool Victoria. There's reference in 1987 to a distribution list for 8Y, identifying a centre at Blackpool for which a Dr. Flanagan was responsible. Blackpool was given a UK HCDO centre number, Centre 71, but again, the documentation describes it as not being an official centre and special arrangements applying. There's only one available annual return, and that's for 1990, which shows the treatment of 1 haemophilia A patient and 1 haemophilia B patient, and both receiving NHS factor 8 and 9 respectively. The only information we have about there's no information about HIV in relation to Blackpool. In relation to hepatitis C, the only information we have is about patients infected through blood transfusions. And again, being the way in which the Look Back programme was rolled out, and how patients infected with transfusions learnt of their infection or didn't learn of their infection, is something we'll be exploring in later hearings. There is a striking gap in relation to the position of one witness who's told the inquiry he was infected with hepatitis C following blood transfusions at the hospital in Blackpool, received transfusions in 78 and 81, only learnt he was hepatitis C positive in 2010 when routine tests were being undertaken. But as I say, the only information we have is about infection with blood transfusions, and we'll explore some of that in more detail in later hearings. So I'm going to turn now to the Lancaster Haemophilia Centre, and there's rather a lot more information available about Lancaster. It was formally designated as a haemophilia centre in 1977, and its director was Dr. Douglas Lee from 1977 to 1989, and then Dr. David Gorst took over as director in 1989. We have a fairly informative statement from Dr. Lee that was prepared for the HIV litigation, and perhaps the easiest thing for me to do is to go to that statement and refer to certain passages in it, because it provides the best information we have about the approach to treatment at Lancaster. It's NHBT 0096558_009. So we can see Dr. Lee explains that by the time he's doing this statement, he's Regional Director of the North West Regional Blood Transfusion Service and had been since April 1989. From January 1976 until that time, he'd been appointed to Lancaster Transfusion Centre as consultant in charge. So he was one of those haematologists who worked both on the transfusion side and on the haemophilia side. And if we can pick that up in the next paragraph. He says, on appointment at Lancaster, I was asked to organise the treatment of haemophiliacs, which was at that time fragmented. This had been divided between 3 physicians and there was no unifying consultant. There were 5 or 6 severely affected patients in the district requiring regular treatment. Because there was always the doctor on call at the transfusion centre, I arranged for the haemophiliacs to attend the centre if they needed treatment. I organised a roster for the treatment of the patients and I also saw them periodically for a review of their general health, the state of their joints, etc., and an outpatient's appointment. Initially, almost all the treatment was based on cryoprecipitate. As factor VIII concentrate became available, the patients were trained in home treatment. I still saw these patients in outpatients approximately once a year, or when they came to pick up factor VIII, or alternatively came in for treatment either for a bad bleed or for some other reasons. So that despite there being only occasional formal appointments, there was in fact regular contact. I severed my links with the patients when my present appointment was ratified in April 1989. Therefore, in all, I knew these patients very well from approximately 1977 until 1989. He then refers in the next paragraph to Lancaster being an associate centre, which deals primarily with treating haemophilia at a basic level. For most other problems, the patients are referred to the Haemophiliac Reference Centre, which was Manchester. He is then commenting on paragraphs in the HIV litigation statement of claim. And I meant to bring that with me, Sarah, in order to be able to match the paragraphs up to the questions, but I don't think it matters in terms of understanding what he says. So if we go a little further down the page, he talks about his main link being with the Manchester Haemophilia Reference Centre, although there was one patient referred to Oxford. He says, I attended periodic meetings which Dr. Wensley would organise, perhaps annually, which provided an update. More recently, Dr. Gunson held meetings concerning the purchase of heat-treated factor VIII. I also had the opportunity to attend the annual meetings of the haemophilia directors. Top of the next page. Again, he says that a new haematologist joined in 1980, but he retained his earlier role in relation to haemophilia care. He refers to some patients having his home telephone number. And then if the next paragraph, he says the total number of patients between 1977 and 1989 would be approximately 10, so a small associate centre. But also, as he says in the next paragraph, an additional commitment was to provide treatment for visiting haemophilia patients. The Northwest branch of the Haemophilia Society purchased a static caravan sited close to Lancaster, and I agreed to receive advance information about visiting haemophiliacs and provide treatment if necessary. If we go top of the next page, he says, we received as much factor VIII as was required for treatment on demand and later for home treatment. He deals with, under what's headed paragraph 92K, with being in the hands of Dr. Wensley in relation to heat-treated concentrates. He says the supply of NHS factor VIII and the purchase of commercial factor VIII was channelled through Manchester. Most of the material used in Lancaster was from NHS sources. We believed that this NHS product was less likely to be contaminated than imported products. One positive step which I took was to try and make sure that individual patients were exposed to as few batches as possible. So there's some evidence of a proactive attempt to limit exposure. He then refers to heat treatment. Next page. Second paragraph, he says heat-treated concentrates were used as soon as these were available to me. We used NHS factor VIII for all my patients except 1 or 2. That reflects the privileged position that Lancaster was in being able to get almost all of our supplies as BPL factor VIII. And then he refers below to the treatment of 2 patients with commercial concentrates who in the past had received large quantities of factor VIII. One patient broke his leg, was on daily doses, so when commercial concentrates had to be used again, it was offered to those 2 patients if we needed to give it to anyone. And then if we go over the page, top of the next page, he refers to using small amounts of imported heat-treated factor VIII from late 1984 from Dr. Wensley. refers to a book called the cryo-pooling book, which recorded the batch number of factor VIII concentrates. And then he then turns to knowledge of risk. I've been aware that haemophiliacs were at risk of acute hepatitis since 1966, when I first became involved with them. I do not know when I became aware that commercial factor VIII had a higher risk. This was a risk faced by anyone who received blood or a blood product. I believe that I first appreciated the risk of chronic hepatitis to haemophiliacs from factor VIII and IX in the mid-70s, because a colleague in Sheffield was interested in liver damage to haemophiliacs. That may be Professor Preston, perhaps. Any treatment with blood products carried the risk of hepatitis. It could have been obtained from the cryoprecipitate and was indeed passed on in this way. And then, top of the next page, he says, from 1977, imported factor VIII and its path from Manchester to my patients is fully documented. I obtained the factor VIII from Manchester. I determined its use only occasionally when necessary, when supplies of NHS factor VIII were not available in sufficient quantity. Next paragraph, he says he used non-heat treated factor VIII exclusively until late 84, and then commercial heat treated as it became available in Manchester. And from April 1985, he believed he used exclusively heat treated product. Bottom of the page, there was a swing back to cryoprecipitate being administered to children and mildly affected adults in the early 1980s because of the risk of hepatitis. Dr. Wensley has indeed always been a powerful advocate of cryoprecipitate. It is a harder product to make and to administer than factor VIII, but his thoughts were that yields of cryoprecipitate over those of concentrate are roughly 70% compared to 20%, and the risk of transfused viruses are certainly less. He would advise this constantly at haemophiliac directors' meetings, and I remember that he was very much alone on this point at one time. Dr. Lee then deals with HIV. The next paragraph, I became aware of the emergence of HIV/AIDS when the virus was identified as HTLV3, when those papers were published concerning strange illnesses amongst homosexuals. I cannot exactly recall when I became aware of AIDS. My recollection is of an involving story from 1981 onwards. I kept myself informed by journals and discussions with colleagues, transfusion directors' meetings, and minutes of haemophilia directors' meetings. I did become aware of the connection between AIDS and blood products, but I cannot remember when. I relied on the meetings of the haemophiliac directors and contact with Dr. Wensley for new information, since my role was to treat haemophilia patients rather than to make policy. I tried to read the leading articles in the Lancet every week and believe I would therefore have read articles on the 15th, 22nd and 29th of January 1983. Top of the next page, we only used imported non-heat treated factor VIII as a second line of treatment. It was never the treatment of choice. It was not used for children and mildly affected patients. And then third paragraph, I can remember advising patients who received either of these products that whatever the risk of the treatment was, it was less than the risk of non-treatment. So that doesn't really tell us much about what he actually said the risk of treatment was. And then we can see a reference to there being 2 patients who seroconverted. The suggestion is they had haemophilia of such severity as to make factor VIII concentrate the only appropriate treatment. And then he refers again to the use of heat-treated. Bottom of the page refers to advice from the Haemophilia Reference Centre directors. I think the date there is wrong. 1982 should be a reference to 1983. And then over the page, he says, cryoprecipitate was used for children and mildly affected haemophiliacs. I've not used desmopressin. And then this, patients were advised of the risk of HIV infection when it was agreed by the haemophilia directors that this was appropriate. Well, we've no evidence of haemophilia directors, if that's a reference, as I would think it might be, to the annual meetings or indeed reference centre director meetings. We've no evidence of any advice being given about risks of communication about risks of HIV infection to patients. The only discussion we really see is from December 1984, that meeting of Elstree, when that's talking about what you tell patients about testing. It's not talking about the logically anterior issue of what you tell them about the risks of treatment. And then, bottom of the page, he says all my haemophiliac patients were tested for HIV infection after appropriate counselling, and that included a full discussion culminating in the patients deciding whether or not they wished to know the results. We were encouraged to test each patient by the haemophiliac directors. 2 patients proved to be HIV positive. 1 did not wish to know. and I saw the other personally and explained the full implications. And he says no, none of the children he treated were tested positive. So that's the evidence from Dr. Lee. In terms of other documents, and I think the returns, again, I can, well, actually, no, I think that the returns, it might be more useful to look at the actual documents. So if we go to HCDO 301173, we can pick up the picture at page 4. So this is the return for 1977 for Lancaster, Director Dr. Douglas Lee. And then total number of haemophilic patients treated during the year, we've got 5, and then I think that says plus 8 visitors. So that is presumably to the caravan that was referred to in Dr. Lee's statement. And then we can see what's being used there, predominantly cryoprecipitate, some NHS factor 8 concentrate, a small amount of cryobuline. If we go to HCDO 301270, we can see in 1978, 10 patients treated, again predominantly with cryoprecipitate and NHS factor 8 concentrate. And there's, I think, no treatment for haemophilia B, none for von Willebrand's. And then 1979 is HCDO 301339. Five haemophilic patients treated during the year. I think that's a reference to haemophilia A again. 2 Christmas disease patients. We can see there's a reference to 837 bottles of cryo being used. And then the primary treatment is with NHS concentrate, 39,640, and then a smaller amount of NHS factor 9 concentrate for the Christmas disease patients. If we go to page 4, there's 1 von Willebrand's patient treated in that year with cryoprecipitate. If we then move to 1980, HCDO 301434, we've got 11 haemophilia A patients and 1 von Willebrand's. The von Willebrand's patients treated with cryoprecipitate. Cryoprecipitate is used in hospitals, 73,000 odd units. NHS factor 8 used hospital and home treatment in a smaller amount. And then we see commercial concentrates being used, relatively small amounts, 6,140 units of factor 8, 604 units of haemophil, and being used in hospital. I don't think we need to go to it, but there are 2 haemophilia B patients treated solely with factor 9 concentrate. If we then move to 1981, HCDO 301535, it says it's not clear whether it's 16 or 15 patients treated, but in any event, if we look then at the page, it's things scribbled out here, so it's not entirely easy to read, but there appears then to result in the usage of 49,600 units of cryoprecipitate, and then what looks like roughly 78,000 units of factor 9, NHS factor 9 concentrate in hospital, 48,000 odd for home treatment, and a smaller amount, 14,800 units of haemophil. A not dissimilar picture from 1982, HCDO 301634. So rather less in terms of cryoprecipitate for the 9 patients. But again, the only commercial concentrate is Haemophilia, and the bulk of the treatment appears to be with NHS concentrates, both in terms of hospital and home treatment. And if we go to 1983, HCDO 301733, (15 patients with haemophilia A treated, 1 carrier. The bulk of the treatment is with NHS concentrates, so 198,000 hospital, 148,000 home treatment, a small amount of cryoprecipitate used in hospital, and a small amount of haemophil used for home treatment. If we go to 1984, HCDO 301825, doesn't appear to be any commercial concentrates used, so just under 25,000 units of cryoprecipitate, 58,730 units of NHS concentrate for hospital, and 91,000 odd for home treatment. And then, I think lastly, we look at 1985, HCDO 301919. There's some usage of profilate for the first time. Again, the product mostly uses NHS concentrate, hospital and home. Cryoprecipitate used to a small extent for haemophilia A patients, and then used for von Willebrand's patients. So the returns appear to be broadly consistent with the narrative account given by Dr. Lee in his statement made as part of the HIV litigation. I don't need to go to the other documents, but there's evidence to suggest that there was a home treatment programme in Lancaster by late 1977. We looked at issues relating to shortages of concentrate in the northwest region during the Manchester presentation. And there are letters from Dr. Lee in the late 80s which refer to that, but it doesn't appear to have greatly affected the supply of NHS concentrate to Lancaster. In terms of knowledge of risk, again, the best evidence we have is Dr. Lee's own statement and his attendance at UK HCDO meetings. There are references to various documents, or a handful of documents, I should say, in the course of the 1970s, which refer to post-transfusion hepatitis. So, for example, in the late 70s and 78, Dr. Lee sent reports of post-transfusion hepatitis to Dr. Maycock. There's a handful of other documents which refer to hepatitis. But we know that Dr. Lee attended most UK HCDO meetings. He didn't attend the 1979 meeting, and it doesn't appear to have been at the meetings in 82, 83 and 84. But the evidence we have would suggest that as the director of a recognised centre, he would have been sent the minutes. And there are various documents we've got which are letters from Ms. Spooner or Dr. Ritz or whoever saying, please find attached the draft minutes, or please find attached the final minutes of meetings. So they do appear to have been routinely circulated to directors, and thus what was discussed would have been known to directors whether or not they attended the actual meetings. In relation to HIV, or rather HTLV3, at the time, Dr. Lee would also have been wearing his transfusion hat. As we saw from the statement, he was both involved in the transfusion service as well as the care of those with haemophilia. And there are various documents showing meetings in the course of, in particular, 1985, in which Dr. Lee and Dr. Gorst are both participating, in which the introduction of HTLV3 testing for blood donations, including at the Lancaster Transfusion Centre, is discussed. So that would have been something which he would have been aware of. You'll have seen from Dr. Lee's evidence in terms of numbers infected with IV. Dr. Lee's account was 2 patients. There's no reason to dispute that or doubt that. The provisional data that UKHCGO supplied to the inquiry identifies only 1 patient testing positive in 1985, but so the UKHCGO data reflects only that which has been reported to it. And so given that Dr. Lee is able to describe the different circumstances of the 2 patients who seroconverted, it may be a more reliable indication than the UKHCGO data. In terms of testing for hepatitis C, there is evidence to suggest that in 1989, patients who'd received blood transfusions in Lancaster were being tested for hepatitis C through the Public Health Laboratory Service. And there's correspondence between the Lancaster Transfusion Centre and Dr. Krask asking Dr. Krask to do a hepatitis C marker. There's also various discussions and communications to which Dr. Lee was party in 1990 and 1991, discussing the introduction of the testing of blood donations for hepatitis C at the Lancaster Transfusion Centre. And it's being contemplated there are discussions taking place at least from July 1990 onwards, although it appears that in common with other centres, donations were only tested from September 1991. Again, I don't think I need to go for it for present purposes because it's Dr. Lee wearing his transfusion hat, and we may want to look at this more in later hearings. But there's communications between Dr. Lee and his local ethical committee in 1991 about joining a hepatitis C study designed by Professor Alan at the Cambridge Regional Transfusion Centre. And it was about testing pre-transfusion samples and post-transfusion samples. Dr. Lee did receive ethical approval for that study. Perhaps if we just look at one document which throws a little light on it, although, as I say, it's with Dr. Lee wearing his transfusion hat. It's NHBT 0112569_001, please. So this just gives a little information about this is a letter to a GP, October 1992, about a particular patient. It talks about the interest in hepatitis C since the marketing of a test which detects antibody to the virus. It refers to the Manchester Centre taking part in a multi-centre study to throw more light on the problem. Again, this is from Dr. Lee wearing his transfusion hat. And then it says this halfway down that paragraph: it was recognised that an opportunity existed to retain samples from patients transfused during July and August 1991 and to use the new test retrospectively to attempt to establish which donations positive for anti-HCV would result in seroconversion in the recipient patients. The study has the full ethical approval of the District Ethical Committee. And then he asks about approaching this particular patient, who was the resident in a nursing home, to obtain consent to test the sample which had been retained in 1991 and to establish whether or not seroconversion had taken place. So we don't have very much of any evidence about testing the haemophilia patients for hepatitis C, and Dr. Lee would have moved on to being in a purely transfusion role by this time. But his own approach in relation to consent in 1992 in relation to the study appears to have been to seek patient consent. I think that is probably all we have about the Lancaster Centre. As I say, the information in relation to hepatitis C testing and diagnosis for bleeding disorder patients at the Haemophilia Centre is little. So I'm then going to deal with Blackburn, won't necessarily complete it before lunch, but I should be able to get a reasonable amount done. So there was a centre at the Blackburn Royal Infirmary from 1977. Dr. David Newsom was the centre's director, and he has provided witness statements to the inquiry. He has told the inquiry in his statement that before he arrived in 1977, haemophilia had not been treated in Blackburn, that the centre was then set up as an associate centre of the Manchester Royal Infirmary, the aim being that rather than having to travel to Manchester, patients in the Blackburn, Burnley and Preston area could travel a shorter distance to be treated with cryoprecipitate if they had a bleed. He explains that cryoprecipitate came from the blood transfusion service, would usually be administered by him, but patients would be followed up at Manchester, and he describes how as time went on, patients were transferred from cryoprecipitate to concentrates. That decision to switch to concentrates he describes as being essentially taken at Manchester, and then the concentrates would be sent to Blackburn for the patient to pick it up locally, and there is some individual witness evidence which backs that up. The hospital itself in Blackburn closed in 2006, and Dr. Newsom moved to the new Royal Blackburn Hospital at that point. Again, his statements provide an account of most patients' decisions in relating to most patients being undertaken in Manchester. If they required operations, those would be undertaken in Manchester. He says occasionally with von Willebrand's patients, operations might be carried out in Blackburn, but if that happened, his usual practice would be to discuss the patient with the Manchester Royal Infirmary staff to ensure they were happy for him to supervise the factor VIII regime and to administer it. In terms of returns, I think I'll try and pick up the relevant data without going to the documents as much as I can. So we have returns from 1978 onwards. To give an idea of the numbers of patients treated, there were 11 haemophilia A patients treated, 3 patients with von Willebrand's in 1978, treated with cryoprecipitate, NHS factor VIII, and at that stage a very small amount of haemophil. The von Willebrand's patients were treated with cryoprecipitate. 1979, 13 haemophilia A patients, 1 haemophilia B, 3 von Willebrand's treated. Again, cryoprecipitate used, but the greater volume of treatment was with NHS factor VIII, and then there were small amounts of 3 different commercial concentrates, propylate, haemophil and cryobulin, used for hospital treatment. Von Willebrand's patients mainly cryoprecipitate, a small amount of NHS factor VIII, and the haemophilia B patients treated with factor IX. 1980, 15 patients with haemophilia A, 1 with haemophilia B, 3 with von Willebrand's treated. In terms of the haemophilia A, it was largely cryoprecipitate in 1980, just under 100,000 units used. A small amount of NHS factor VIII, that was in hospital, no home treatment. Von Willebrand's exclusively with cryoprecipitate, haemophilia B exclusively with NHS factor IX. It's difficult to read the 1981 return. Excuse me. In terms of numbers, it's 14 patients with haemophilia A, 2 with haemophilia B, and 3 with von Willebrand's. Again, it looks as though it's predominantly cryoprecipitate used in hospital and a small amount of NHS factor VIII for home treatment. Von Willebrand's only with cryoprecipitate. Haemophilia B patients only with NHS factor IX. There's no 1982 return. For 1983, similar number of patients, 13 haemophilia A, 3 haemophilia B, 3 von Willebrand's. Just under 44,000 units of cryo, 64,400 NHS factor VIII concentrates. Most of that is for home treatment. A small amount of haemophil, 4,600, no other commercial concentrates. 1985, the way in which it describes bottles and units makes it quite difficult to follow. But in 1985, it's 15 patients with haemophilia A, 4 with haemophilia B, 1 with von Willebrand's. Again, what we see is predominantly cryoprecipitate and NHS factor 8. There's reference to, however, to 134 bottles of prophylate being used for home treatment, and the return appears to suggest that a bottle might represent 250 units, and that would give 33,500 units. Again, the picture for von Willebrand's patients is exclusively cryoprecipitate, and for haemophilia B patients exclusively NHS factor 9. So that's the picture that emerges from the returns. There is witness evidence that the inquiry has about a patient with von Willebrand's disease treated with cryoprecipitate at the centre in Blackburn, and that is the second case we've identified from the materials of a patient being infected with HIV from cryoprecipitate. Dr. Newsom in his statement has described there being no particular policies in place in relation to treatment usage when he took up his post. He doesn't recall ever purchasing concentrates. He believes that they obtained them from Manchester Royal Infirmary. Both in terms of NHS concentrate, he can't recall ever purchasing commercial concentrate, and again assumes or thinks that was obtained directly from Manchester. So if that's a convenient point to stop, I can do a few more minutes after lunch on Blackburn and then move to the other centres.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now then till 2 o'clock.
Thank you, sir.
So 2 o'clock.